So there are things that you have to do every day. I don't talk about it, but it's very important. There are pathways in your body that help you age or not age.
Dr. Kaufmann is the author and creator of the Kaufmann Protocol, a systematic explanation of why we age on a cellular basis, coupled with an organized system to delay the aging process. This theory was introduced in her book, The Kaufmann Protocol, Why We Age and How to Stop It, which has been recognized by many longevity leaders as the go-to tool for understanding the aging process. She has more recently published the Kaufmann Protocol, Aging Solutions, with an updated and expanded dive into the science of longevity.
All drug use in terms of cocaine, tobacco, pot, all of those things are negative epigenetic modifiers. We know that caloric restriction, exercise, that sort of thing is positive epigenetic modification. It keeps you sort of younger. Things have negative consequences. Now, the good news is that your body has ways to fix this. There are 5 ways to fix your DNA.
Hi, my name is Chris Burris. I'm a longevity expert and the chief scientist at a lab focused on a longevity molecule. My primary focus is to help people live longer and better lives with science. Make sure to subscribe and share so you and your friends can live longer and better. Well, actually, so you and your friends can live beyond the norms. Welcome to the next talk on the Uncovering the Secrets of Longevity, Live Beyond the Norms Health Summit. If I told you our next speaker has the ultimate solution for longevity, the solution for all the things that go wrong as our bodies age, actually down to our cellular level, really, we are talking about the panacea for longevity, you would want to stay tuned in, right? Well, let me tell you, you want to stay tuned in for our next speaker. Dr. Kaufmann is the author and creator of the Kaufmann Protocol, a systematic explanation of why we age on a cellular basis, coupled with an organized system to delay the aging process. This theory was introduced in her book, The Kaufmann Protocol, Why We Age and How to Stop It, which has been recognized by many longevity leaders as the go-to tool for understanding the aging process. She has more recently published the Kaufmann Protocol, Aging Solutions, with an updated and expanded dive into the science of longevity. Dr. Kaufmann, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure to be here. This is going to be fun.
Yes. So I heard one of your interviews and know you started off as a tropical ecologist. Can you talk about how you transitioned from a tropical ecologist to a longevity expert? And because I have to, my first thought is that you were studying some sort of long-lived species and found in that species the secret to longevity. But what's the real story?
So that sounds fantastic. And if I ever make a movie, then that's going to be the plot line. But unfortunately, it has absolutely nothing to do with that. I went to college as a biologist. I just think science is unbelievably amazing. I was attracted to the tropics because I went to University of Miami, and just the tropics, the plants are just so unbelievably amazing. So I did a lot of plant research. And it was all plant physiology, tropical ecology sort of deal, how they deal with different environments and how they can adjust. I mean, obviously they have no brain, right? But the cells themselves do amazingly cool things. And I was happily cruising along. I was going to get a PhD, realized at some point that I didn't want to be broke. And my dad, who was a physician, said, if you go to med school, I'll pay for it. So I thought, okay, plants are delightful. Plants don't pay bills. So I bailed and I went to med school. So let's see, I was going to be a general surgeon. I did a year of that. I'm like, bowel's disgusting. I did a year of brain surgery. That was incredibly cool. Good stories that have come from that. I've mucked around in people's brains. That's kind of fun. But it was kind of depressing. So I ended up as an anesthesiologist. And the fun thing about that is it's basically, you have to know all of human physiology, all biology, all disease sources. And then if you tie in the idea that I'm sort of a rock climber athlete, I didn't want to age. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to take all of my knowledge and tie it up into one big giant package and figure this out, and then proceed ahead. So that's kind of what I did.
All right. So I actually heard that before. So I think this breaks down into tropical ecologist. That's the bat catching phase, right?
Yep.
And then you have the evolutionary biology. That's the monkey to man phase, right?
Yeah.
That was also the broke phase. So you
Yeah.
went into medicine, general surgeon, and then brain surgeon, which is the depressing phase. You mentioned that briefly, and now chief pediatric anesthesiologist. I think there's a change going on there, but in Hollywood, Florida, that's the I want to keep rock climbing, so become an expert on longevity phase. And is that the phase we're still in?
Yeah, I think that's about right. And the cool thing about, so if you figure out like what disease is, right? Diseases are because cells fail, right? So then you think about pharmacology. You can fix why cells fail via medications or drugs or molecular intervention. And that's why I call them molecular agents. They're molecular interventions. And then the question is always like, well, what dose? What's the timing? Blah, blah, blah. And that is called anesthesia. So by complete accident, I accumulated this set of skills to try to undo this puzzle.
And interestingly, right, if you think about pharmacology, right, correct me if I'm wrong, that really does go back to ecology, because most of the pharmaceuticals that we have are founded and found in the plants that are available on our planet.
Right. So what's cool about that, right, is if you go to these crazy environments, and I'm a child of the tropics, but I'm also a rock climber. So I've been to, the peaks of the Himalayas and the peaks of Argentina, but all of these very challenging areas, right? And plants have to live there. And it's not like they can get up and go, you know what, this is a little stressful, I'm going to walk down the hill. They can't. So they have to figure out how to deal with the stresses of the environments in which they are in. And that's how you get these really kick-ass chemicals that now we can come along and steal them. And so for people that live in areas that have, money, they create drugs out of them. And for places that don't, they sort of become folklore cures. Right. But we are allowed to steal each and every one of these ideas and go, what is the molecule at work? And can it benefit my cells? How does it do it? And how do I get it? And so you could do all of these things, right? So we benefit from the ecology and the evolution of these plants.
And there's more than one of the interviews that I've done for this Longevity Summit that talks about, hey, I'm interested in this. Let me go to different regions of the world and kind of, hey, what do you guys take for overall health? And then let's figure out what's in that thing and turn that into a medicine or a supplement in the cases of my conversations. Mm-hmm. All right. So you talk about the tenets of aging. Can you list those real quick, and then we can dive into them individually? Sure.
And so I'm tongue-tied today. So what's sort of funny is people go, well, why do you have the tenets when they have the hallmarks? And so I always like to address that first. And the hallmarks were a great idea. When I started doing this like 10 years ago, there were, a set number of them. I thought the organizational scheme was absolutely horrid. And then they just keep adding them on in no real organized fashion. And that drove me absolutely bonkers. So I stepped back, kind of ignored it, and created the 7 tenets. And it's organized on a cell level with a lot of subcategories, right? So, and then you can keep adding subcategories as we know more and more. So that's sort of like the preemptive statement. So tenet 1 is DNA alterations. And these are bad things that happen to your DNA over time. So this is telomeres getting shorter, epigenetic modification. Some is good, most is bad. And then, of course, chromosomal rearrangement in the cell. So the combination of euchromatin versus heterochromatin, et cetera. So that's DNA. That's tenet 1. 2 is failure of your mitochondria. Of course, mitochondria create energy. They do, a plethora of other things as well. And mitochondria fail probably for 6 or 7 different reasons. 3 is what I call pathways. There are pathways in your body that help you age or not age. And in this category are the 7 sirtuins, the AMP kinase, and then, of course, the mTOR pathway. 4 is what I call quality control. And this is the recognition that things go wrong and you have to fix it. So this is knowing that there's DNA errors every day and there's proteostasis issues and what you have to fix those. And then when you can't actually fix them. So that's autophagy. 5 is the idea that your immune system becomes your inflamed system over the course of time, which has a whole list of subtopics. 6 is what I call individual cell requirements. And this is the acknowledgement that a senescent cell is different than a stem cell. Brain cell is different than a liver cell, for example. And then lastly, waste management. And this is the idea that you have to take out the trash. This is mostly glycation issues because glucose, we need it, but too much of it is obviously a bad thing and causes a plethora of issues. And then lipofuscin, which accumulates over time that you can't really get rid of. Anyway, so that in brief are the 7 tenets.
All right, let's jump into those because I know you talked about kind of subcategories. You probably use a different kind of phrase word, but so tenet 1, DNA alterations sounds bad, obviously bad, but like dig into that a little bit more, please.
All right, so everyone knows, and this is amazing because of popular literature, Time Magazine, National Geographic, et cetera. Everyone seems to know what a telomere is now, which is quite nice, right? So the telomere is, of course, the ends of your DNA. You have 4 per chromosome. Multiply that by the chromosomes in your cell, so you have a lot of them. But every time a cell divides, it gets a little shorter and a little shorter, and of course, this leads to the Hayflick limit. How many times can a normal cell divide? Pluripotent stem cells, et cetera, that sort of thing, they have telomerase, which adds it back, but over the course of time, that too fails. So when your telomeres get too short, the cells stop dividing, and that's sort of the end of the line for whatever that cell lineage is. Another thing that happens is epigenetic modification. The genes in your nucleus are packed around histones, and I don't know how much your audience knows. Both histones and DNA get covered with what I call decorations. So your DNA gets methylated, your histones get methylated, phosphorylated, acetylated, sumoylated. There's probably 1,000 different additions to the histones. And these collections of things basically compact or decompact the DNA, allowing for certain genes to get created or to get translated into proteins. Right. And we know that things that are intrinsically bad for you are negative epigenetic modifiers. So we know that, all drug use in terms of cocaine, tobacco, pot, all of those things are negative epigenetic modifiers. We know that caloric restriction, exercise, that sort of thing is positive epigenetic modification. It keeps you sort of younger. So everyone knows you can get your epigenetic clock measured. Steve Horvath, of course, started this. Now there's a zillion other ones. Just remember how many pieces and parts they're looking at to tell you sort of what physiologic age you are. But it's only your physiologic age based on epigenetics. It does not necessarily represent all of aging.
So as your telomeres are shortening with age, I mean, I've got a couple questions there. So one of them is there's a lot of talk about epigenetic expression, and you kind of mentioned it with histones. Is there a correlation to like epigenetic failure and the telomere shortening? Like, is there some sort of? I mean, it seems like there might be, but is there a correlation there?
Well, they both get worse with time. So in terms of the direction they're going, they're correlated. But in absolute correlation, no, not necessarily.
Okay.
It's a nice thought. Telomeres get shorter because of replicative senescence. They also get shorter because of oxidative stress and glycation issues. If you look at your nucleotides, right, there's T, A, C, and G. G is guanine, and the body does not like guanine. It gets oxidized more than anything else. It gets glycated more than anything else. And if you look at the single strand aspect of your telomeres, it's TTA, GGG. So 50% of your single stranded telomeres are guanine. So they just get abused. So every time they get abused, your telomeres are just going to suffer for it, which is not necessarily correlated to epigenetics.
Okay. And one of the things we'll be talking about in this Kaufmann protocol is how to kind of protect at least the telomeres in this case. All right.
Yep.
DNA alteration. Number 2, mitochondrial failure. Energy is obviously important, and this has to do with our good friend mitochondria. What do we need to focus on regarding energy when we talk about longevity?
So obviously your cell can do absolutely nothing without mitochondria, right? Every cell, with the exception of red cells, because they don't live very long, have mitochondria. Depending on the activity of your cell, you're going to have either more or less. A standard cell, anywhere between 5 to 100, up to 500,000 in an ovulating oocyte. Anything that requires energy has the most. The brain has a lot. The heart has a lot. Anything that's continuously sucking up energy has a ton of mitochondria. Mitochondria undergoes a lot of damage over the course of time. So number 1, there's NAD deficiency, right? Just deficiency of baseline materials. And there's reasons that you're NAD deficient, but obviously sort of optimizing that is significant. And you're going to ask me, well, what does NAD do? Because everyone does. So NAD does 4 essential things. Number 1, it's part of the electron transport chain, which is the subunit within the inner lining of the mitochondria, and that's where you create energy. So that's 1. Number 2, we haven't gotten to it yet, but there's pathways called sirtuins, and these drive all cellular homeostasis. And NAD is a natural. It's a cofactor for this. What happens is the sirtuin, because it's a histone deacetylase, takes the acetylase and glues it onto NAD. So you absolutely have to have NAD for your sirtuins to work. So that's 2. 3, when you have DNA damage, your cell actually takes the NAD molecule apart and puts part of it into your DNA to fix holes, right? So as you get older, you have more holes, leads to an NAD deficiency. And then lastly, NAD, the measurement or the quantity serves as a communication device between the nucleus and the mitochondria, sort of telling it how much energy it has and directing its processes. So as you get older, you are NAD deficient, and therefore all of these processes are not going to work very well.
So NAD, important to energy, important to your sirtuins, repair as a repair signaler, and really as an energy signaler. So like that sounds incredibly important. That's probably why NAD is on the mind of like every longevity expert out there. We'll probably dig into that a little bit more as you talk about kind of solutions for that. Mm-hmm. And you touched on pathways. Is there any more that we want to talk about in terms of pathways?
Well, we'll get there. So in terms of mitochondria, there's shortage of regular materials, right? You have to worry about your mitochondrial DNA. You have to worry about fission and fusion that takes a dive over time. Mitophagy, which is, of course, autophagy of mitochondria, that takes a dive over time. One of my favorite things is called the mitochondrial permeability transition pore. And this is this kind of neat pore that goes from the outer membrane to the matrix. And when you're young, it flickers. It sort of opens and closes. I could consider it like a pop-off valve, and it releases some sort of, stress. But as you get older, the pores open longer and longer and longer. And as a consequence, fluids come into the mitochondria, sort of swelling it, making it less efficient. And then cytotoxins sort of flow out. If you think of mitochondria, they're like little nuclear units. They're very, very toxic. So when cytochrome C goes out, as an example, it actually it triggers all the apoptotic proteins of your cell and tells it to die. So taking care of that pore is extraordinarily important to the health of your entire cell, right? Anyway, yep. And then sort of lastly, in the how to take care of your mitochondria department, of the sirtuins, there's 7, and we'll get to that in a minute, but specifically sirtuin 3 drives all homeostasis of your mitochondria. And there's some evidence by the time you're 35 to 40, that sirtuin is not working very well, therefore your mitochondria is not working very well, therefore all of this starts taking a dive, and we know that aging starts at roughly 35 for most people.
So sirtuin 3 is something that we'll be addressing in the protocol as well.
Absolutely. All of this gets addressed in the protocol because the goal is identify all of the problems and then find solutions. Like, I love Aubrey de Grey, but he tells you like how horrible life is, and then he walks away. Right? You're like, oh, that's the worst movie ever, right? You'd have to like...
Guess what happens at the end of this movie? Everyone dies. Thank you.
And that's like the most depressing thing in the world. So what I try to do is, okay, we have these issues. What do we do, right? And so that's what the protocols are. Let's address as many of these issues as humanly possible based on how aggressively any one individual wants to do this.
So we've got a lot in just the mitochondria. That was a lot there, right? Mitophagy, permeability, the mitochondrial DNA as another separate DNA that has its own challenges. Does that wrap up mitochondrial? Is that enough for mitochondrial failure?
Well, I mean, we could go on for hours about mitochondria, but that's probably good.
Okay, so you did touch a little bit on pathways. Let's dig into pathways a little bit more.
Okay, so there's 7 mammalian sirtuins, and people are always like, well, what's a sirtuin? So it is a histone deacetylase enzyme. And that sounds kind of simple, right? Just takes acetyl groups off of histones. But it turns out it's also histones and non-histones. But essentially, it turns on, usually, different enzymes or proteins around the cell, right? And there's obviously there's sirtuin 1 through 7, but 1 is general cellular homeostasis. We know the most about that one. 3, as I said, is in the mitochondria. And 6 is within the nucleus, sort of associated with the chromatin, and is associated with DNA repair mechanisms. The other ones we know a little bit less about. I'm sort of like diving into 7 right now because it's associated with like the euchromatin heterochromatin balance, but that's a whole nother story. But as you get older, there's evidence that by the time you're 40-ish, your sirtuins are dropping. And therefore, by correlation, all cellular homeostasis is dropping. So what we want to do here is trigger our sirtuins, and then we need to have our NAD as well because it's a necessary cofactor for the activity of sirtuins. So if people just take like a sirtuin activator and still be NAD deficient, like nothing's going to happen. So that's sort of a pairing that's absolutely necessary.
Okay. So when you're talking about homeostasis, you're just like, it's trying to reach a balance with the other components that are in the system. And then if some of those components are getting, not replenished as much as we age, then the whole system is just struggling to stay in balance.
Correct.
All right. Anything else here in pathways? So we've got sirtuin. 7 is going to be in your next book, I guess.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah, the next actually book it'll have a deep dive into sirtuins because that's been like one of my pushes this year. Like I'm obsessed with 3 and 6, and I'm like, well, I feel bad. I'm like ignoring 7. So that'll all be in book 3. But in this pathways, let's see. Then we also talk about the AMP kinase pathway. And this is a pathway. So AMP kinase is sort of funky. It's backwards. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy coinage of the cell. AMP, adenosine monophosphate, obviously is lack of energy because energy is in the phosphate bonds. So by measuring how much AMP you have, which is what AMP kinase does, it tells you how much energy you don't have. It's completely backwards. But what it does do then is it changes your cell such that you are looking for more energy and turning off systems that require energy. And this sort of puts you in a state of cellular hibernation, right? And anything in hibernation, the longevity is improved. And this is sort of why caloric restriction diets are very effective because it basically triggers your cells to say, oh, I'm energy deficient, therefore I'm going to semi-shut down, work as efficiently as possible, and then people tend to live longer and cells do better. So that's AMP kinase. The good news is that you can activate it with drugs or pharmaceuticals and even over-the-counter stuff to trick your body into thinking that you're starving without actually having to starve, which I love because I'm a terrible dieter. And then the last I'm a junk food junkie, and it's embarrassing to admit, but I do. And then the last pathway is the mTOR pathway. This is the pathway of youth. It builds things. It's like AMP kinase, but it does the opposite. It says, aha, we have energy. We are building things. And so when you're young, it's very useful. As you get older, your cells get pushed to do things that they really can't, and it creates a whole cascade of problems. And this is why rapamycin is so popular in terms of deactivating the mTOR pathway. And there's, those wars right now, how much and when and blah, 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 blah. But that's what the rapamycin battle is about.
I always think, the story of rapamycin is just amazing, right? I think it's the island of Papua New Guinea, right? And like that whole story is amazing. I heard that story on a podcast on Radiolab, just amazing. And then the fact that we've got processes in our body. mTOR is like the R in mTOR is rapamycin. So it's actually the drug that they found, and they're like, oh, it does this thing. So we need to name this process after the drug we found. Like, I find those stories pretty fascinating. Now, you said that AMPK, and if I'm misquoting, please let me know, it causes hibernation, and that intermittent fasting or fasting can actually slow that down. I was under the impression that intermittent fasting also kind of amps up apoptosis. Are they similar, or what's the relationship there?
So apoptosis, what it does is it triggers autophagy.
Autophagy, yeah.
So here's what's happening, and I like to think about an old car. All right, you've got this fantastically old car, right? And it's not working exactly, but it's okay, right? If you had a lot of energy, would you keep the old car? No, you'd toss it to your neighbor and buy a brand new shiny car. You have unlimited resources, right? Now let's say you're broke. What do you do with the car? You use it as little as you can, as efficiently as you can, And you don't want to use as much gas because you can't pay for that either, right? So that is what AMP kinase does. And if the car gets to the point that you can't even start it, are you going to junk it? Oh, no, no. You're going to recycle the parts to get as much out of it as humanly possible, right? You're going to take off the radiator, perhaps the steering wheel. That's autophagy. You're destroying what doesn't work, taking out the pieces that do to create organelles or cells that are working, and they're more efficient.
Okay. All right.
So that is my stupid old car model.
I like that. All right. So we're good. Pathways. So anything else that you?
That's pretty good for the high level overview.
Good. And next is quality errors. Tenet 4, quality errors. Errors obviously bad. What causes them, and what do we need to do to fix them?
Okay. So what happens is I like to think of your cell as little factories. These people, your listener would be like, she uses too many analogies and it's really annoying.
No. I if any listener is saying that, they should contact me and I will have a conversation with them.
Fair.
Because these analogies are awesome.
So if you think about your cell as a little factory, right? Usually when cells are nice and happy and healthy and all the pieces are brand new, not only is the machinery good, but all the widgets that they are making are good. Right? Now, as your cell gets older, you have to realize that it's not going to be the same. So if you think about the machinery and the instructions to the machinery, that's your DNA. Right?
Right.
All the blueprints to whatever little widget you're going to make. Your DNA has 10 to the 4th to 10 to the 5th. It's a lot of zeros. DNA errors per cell per day. Per cell.
A lot of errors. Yeah.
It's a lot of errors. Why? Oxidative damage, free radical damage, UV radiation, chemical stress, random bad luck. All of these things contribute to DNA errors. Now, the good news is that your body has ways to fix this. There are 5 ways to fix your DNA. There's 2 single-stranded. There's Nur and Burr. And then there's the big double-stranded ones. There's homogeneous and non-homogeneous repair. And then there's mismatch repair. All of those things takes coordination. It takes a lot of energy, but you can fix your DNA. The problem, however, is as you get older, the repair mechanisms start to fail. The good news, however, to a certain degree, is we know how we can upregulate these repairs. So that's kind of cool. So that's the DNA. Now the question is, what about the widgets that you're actually making? So proteostasis is a huge science because what they're making are the widgets are proteins. And each cell has the capacity to theoretically make between 5,000 and 10,000 different proteins. And usually they're doing pretty well. But there's so many things that can go wrong with a protein just because the 3-dimensional structure of the protein is what gives its ability to work, right? Everything works on 3-dimensional structure in molecule world. So every protein has not everyone, but most big proteins have chaperone proteins, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, from soup to nuts, taking care of your proteins is a huge, expensive deal. And the cool thing is one of the things we can do is actually upregulate your chaperones such that you have less damage to your proteins. So that's kind of cool. And then lastly, if all of this fails, then the cell or the organelle undergoes autophagy, which is just recycling of the whole thing soup to nuts.
Okay, so we've got our factory. Our factory has problems caused by oxidation, UV, chemical, just random. And you've got 5 fixers. So those are things that we want to address.
DNA. Yep.
Right. And then the widgets that are coming out of the factory have some processes to fix those because we want those proteins to be well. And then when we're like, hey, this factory is garbage, let's start pulling the parts out of it. So that goes back to the car example. Okay.
Yep.
Good. All right. Number 5, inflammatory issues. Talk about inflammation and, the word inflammaging. This may even be a bigger tenet than some of the others. That would be a great question that I might ask later. Negative impacts of inflammation.
All right, so it starts out, your immune system is an amazingly beautiful thing. It's extremely ornate, complex, et cetera, and it keeps us safe from all of the pathogens out there. But over the course of time. And as our cells fail, instead of attacking other things, it attacks our cells. So you get a rise in all of the inflammatory factors. You get a rise in autoimmune diseases. You get a failure of vaccines. You get a rise in malignancies of immune cells, right? Lymphomas and leukemias and that sort of thing. So the whole system goes awry over the course of time. And it does contribute to your systemic inflammation, which is, you're right, is inflammaging. But there's other places that it comes from as well. But it's the whole system of inflammation is absolutely, it gets way out of control, which is why we measure CRP and your SED rate and a variety of other things. So it is a huge focus. So, I'm probably on like 7 anti-inflammatories at all times. But it is one of the key aspects of aging, but it also is very personal dependent to determine like which tenet is more important for any one individual. So for a lot of us, that's it. But for some people, it's not.
All right, and sometimes which one you address also has to do with like how easy is it to address and to what degree can you address it. All right, number 6, individual cell requirements. So I guess you're saying like not all cells are the same. Actually, I'm not guessing. You said that. Can you share, just because this is interesting to me, like 1 or 2 cells that you kind of have to manage differently, and what are they, and why do you have to manage them differently?
Sure. So every time I talk about cells, I put up like this generic picture of a cell, and I pretend like all cells are the same. The caveat being, of course, we know that that's absolutely not true at all. The biggest examples, of course, stem cells, right? We have stem cells all over our body, and we want to be as kind and loving to them as is humanly possible. So there are many, many ways to do this. And everyone loves hyperoxic oxygen therapy, like we talked about that a little bit earlier, but high oxygen will in fact kill your stem cells. So I'm adamantly opposed. But there are innumerable things you can do to keep your stem cells healthy and happy. At the same time, diametrically opposed, in fact, are senescent cells. Some people call them zombie cells. I think of them as grumpy old man cells. And the reason I do this—
That's the one that drives the car? That sounds like the one who—
No. This is the fat guy in the factory who's been there for 50 years. He's fat, he's grumpy, and all he does is eat donuts and whine. This is the guy, right?
And tell you you're doing a bad job.
Yes, and he's very inflammatory. Like, right?
That's awesome.
Because it's true. So, because the reason, right, you take a normal cell, and it has DNA damage, and we now know that that's very, very common. The cell goes into a state of hibernation called quiescence, and it tries to fix it, right? And if it can fix it, then, fantastic, it goes on to being a happy little cell. If it cannot fix it, the cell has 3 choices. It can either commit cell suicide, which is apoptosis. It can become a cancer cell, which is not good. Hopefully the immune system will come and get it, or not, or you get cancer. Or lastly, the cells change morphology, meaning they get fat. They literally get fat. Their walls become less descript. The organelles within them become less descript. And they exude something called the SASP, which is essentially an inflammasome. And it's just a flood of cytokinins, and it makes everything in the area toxic. And scientists think that the reason senescent cells do this, is that it would cause immune cells to then get rid of the senescent cells. And this works when you are young and your immune system is healthy. But as you get older and your senescent cell burden goes up, the immune system is less able to get rid of these cells, right? So you sort of hit this exponential point where you are just way more senescent-y than you should be. And this is just another place where inflammatory factors are just sort of exuding out from everywhere. So that's the grumpy guy who's just fat, globby, not doing what he's supposed to do, and toxic to everyone.
And he's actually messing up the factory next to him. He's not even just ruining everything that's happening in the current factory. He's setting off an alarm that distracts everybody in the factory next door, and now that's operating.
Exactly. And in fact, scientifically, it's called the paracrine effect, right? So or you could say it's the one bad apple in the bucket. One bad apple then makes all of the bad apples bad, and that's exactly what happens.
All right, so that's we have the contrast of the stem cells and senescent cells, and those need to be managed very differently. Stem cells encourage, and then senescent cells decourage to the greatest degree possible. And that brings us to tenet number 7, waste management and glucose management. Talk about that, about cellular waste management.
Right. So cells obviously need some sort of energy source. Glucose everyone focuses on, but there's galactose, there's fructose, there's ribose, there's a zillion of them. But essentially, anytime you have glucose, and we'll just use it as the example, but they all do it. I like to say that it's sticky on the outside and it's sticky on the inside, right? So, take a lollipop, lick it, it's going to stick to everything. Glucose does exactly the same thing. A glucose molecule by itself can glycate something and coat it. But even more importantly, a glucose molecule or any molecule, basically a reducing sugar in oxidizing conditions with a little metal floating around, turns into an AGE, which is called an advanced glycation end product, an AGE. And these things, they stick to proteins, and they just basically, it's a 6 non-enzymatic step from glucose and protein and boom, they're stuck. And number one, it destroys the protein, right? We talked about protein damage. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is these things are extremely inflammatory, and that's another reason that you get inflamed. But they destroy tissue. They like to land on things. And if that thing that they land on is long-lived in your body, then that body part is doomed. So, for example, collagen tends not to turn over all that quickly. So the collagen in your skin, the collagen in your bone, the collagen in your heart, it gets glycated or covered in these AGEs, and it becomes more fragile. And the skin or the collagen example that I like to use is if you take a cloth napkin, right? Go to the nice restaurant, cloth napkin, you can slide the fibers wherever you pull it, right? And it always just keeps going back into shape. But as soon as you put a drop of super glue in the middle of the napkin and let it sort of dry, right? And you pull the napkin, the fibers break, right? Now all of a sudden you have a crappy structural napkin. And that's what AGEs do to your collagen, in addition to all of the rest of your tissues in your body. So AGEs are extremely harmful. If they stick to lipids, they're they're just AGE lipids or they're AGE DNAs. Basically, everything in your body gets glycated. And we measure this via your hemoglobin A1C, which is just glucose glued onto your hemoglobin. And it's just a 3-month turnover. But you have to assume that that's turning over and the rest of your body isn't or is not as quickly. So you're becoming more and more and more glycated over the course of time. The good news, and people are like, oh, that's depressing. There's many, many, many ways to defeat that. Good news in the end. And then lastly, lipofuscin. Every time something undergoes autophagy, and this is back to like taking the pieces out of the car. Unfortunately, the pieces of the car that you can't use, sometimes the cell doesn't know what to do with it. So it does what we all do. It shoves it in the back and ignores it.
In the junk drawer.
Exactly. I call this the kitchen junk drawer, right? The longer you are in your house or your apartment or whatever, there's a drawer in your kitchen filled with crap, right? That is lipofuscin. If cells
often hard to open that drawer, actually. Like you gotta
right. So your kitchen doesn't work. Thus, your cell doesn't work. There was some study that looked at the brains of like 90-year-olds or 100-year-olds, and like half of it was filled with lipofuscin, right? Because if you have lipofuscin in a cell that splits, generally speaking, the cell's pretty smart, and it splits that as well, and you can get rid of part of it. But for cells that don't split, like your neurons in your head, it's stuck there. It's stuck there forever. So the best thing to do, it's hard to get rid of it. The best thing to do is sort of reduce the accumulation thereof. And there are tricks to do that.
Hey, super quick break from the podcast. Hopefully you're loving it. This is a way you can support the podcast and take advantage of a great offer. We're offering 50% off of one of our MCT bottles. MCT is an amazing oil. Add the ESS60 molecule to it. It's even more amazing. All you got to do is leave a review on iTunes, send us a notification that you've left that review. We'll get you a coupon code that'll get you 50% off of our MCT oil and free shipping. Back to the podcast. Okay, so from a waste management, we've got AGE and then lipofuscin. I think there was, is that really cover the two keys?
That's pretty, okay. The AGEs are such a huge topic.
Right.
So the answer is yes.
And you spoke about AGEs actually destroying proteins, attaching to them so then they can't do their job. So that's different than the factory producing errored proteins. That's actually, hey, the factory managed to produce a quality protein and then AGEs are out there like just damaging them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we've identified.
AGEs damage not only the proteins that are being made, but the machinery that makes them.
Makes them. Right. Yeah.
It's all devastation, doom and gloom.
And that's the end of this talk. Next up, Aubrey de Grey. Okay, we have identified the 7 tenets of aging. It would seem we need some sort of panacea to solve all of these. You have laid out such a panacea. That's an acronym. Before you go through the protocol, can you describe your rating system? Because I found that rating system very, very interesting.
Yeah. So when I started down this road many years ago, it drove me bonkers. Again, I'm a bit of an organizational nut. That I'd say, well, why do you take agent X? Like whatever it is. And they're like, oh, my grandmother's uncle's brother told me this was really good for me. And I'm like, man, spot on. Good scientific research, right? That's awesome. Fantastic. And people do it all the time. It's really funny. So I'm like, yeah, that's got to go. So what I do is I take some agent, be it, resveratrol, astaxanthin, curcumin, some random thing, right? And I read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles about that agent. And I put it through the rigors of what it does in each of the 7 tenets. And the idea is if it does absolutely nothing, I can't find anything, it's a 0. If there's some evidence that it's useful in terms of a cell culture or a test tube or something of that nature, it gets a 1. If it does,
and again, that's in its particular category.
That's in a category.
Okay.
That's correct. And then if it does something useful in rodents that's repeatable, or any non-human mammal, really, right? Because people like to experiment on strange mammals. It gets a 2. And then if there's solid human evidence, it gets a 3. But this is per tenet. So what happens now is that every agent that I look at, I think there's 50 of them now, come with a 7-digit rating number to tells you what we know about that agent. It may not be entirely factual because, agent X may be amazing for your DNA, but no one's looked at it, right? So the ratings are very conservative. Mm-hmm. And they tend to be more conservative for agents that come from poor areas of the world because they don't have a ton of money to do human studies. I mean, some of these things may be the best things in the world, but we just don't know. Right. So my ratings are conservative, and the ratings will frequently go up over time as more studies come out. So people get really angry at me. They're like, 2 years ago, you said it was a 2, and now it's a 3. Well, which is it? And the answer is it's always the higher number because there's always more evidence coming to light. Right?
Yeah, that's the. I mentioned this in my book. There's where your actual decision making changes, and there's a famous quote. I don't remember who it was by off the top of my head, but it was a scientist testifying before Congress, and the congressman was like, "You've changed your answer. Why have you changed your answer?" He says, "Well, sir, when I get new evidence, I change my answer. What do you do?" like you really should have a way. Now, this is interesting. Are there any components you have to think, right? Obviously, poisons would actually be like a negative number in some categories, right? If it just ran around and like killed your stem cells. In fact, you might say hyperbaric chambers are a negative when it comes to stem cells. And I don't know exactly which tenet you would throw that on.
So stem cells would be individual cell requirements. So okay. That's tenet 6.
So you could have a -3. So I haven't seen any minuses.
There aren't. So the answer is, as I'm reading along,
yeah. Go ahead.
I just don't. As soon as I hit something, I'm a physician. Like, do no harm first.
Yeah.
As soon as I hit anything that says could be problematic, nasty side effects, anything that's not beneficial, I toss it.
Right.
And I get these emails from around the globe all the time. Well, what do you think about blah, blah, blah? Or why haven't you rated blah, blah, blah? And I'm like, the answer is number 1, I can't rate absolutely everything because it's so time consuming. But 2, things have negative consequences. If things say like, a moderately high dose or something is going to cause cancer or cause sudden death. Well, why the hell would I want to put it in a book? Because maybe they're not reading the fine print. Maybe they're just going to see it on my list of agents and go, aha, she endorses this. And then I kill someone by accident. So we're not doing that. So everything that I look at is beneficial at minimum.
Okay. And it does make me think of rapamycin. My understanding is like higher dose. So this comes into like the dosing is the poison, right? Whatever the famous phrase, or the dosing is the medicine. Because my understanding is like higher doses of rapamycin can actually be very detrimental. How do you manage that particular kind of aspect?
So the answer is I don't rate rapamycin, and I don't recommend rapamycin because of
Ah.
that very reason.
Yeah, okay.
Rapamycin is a absolute, it blocks mTOR completely, right? That's what it does. So it blocks cell turnover. So if you think about it, what do we need high cell turnover for? It blocks hippocampal turnover. And there's a lot of rodent studies that suggest that it destroys memory, different types of memory in rodents. I think that's a really bad idea. It's going to destroy rapid turnover of intestinal cells. It's going to, like anything, honestly, that turns over rapidly, it's not good. So then people go, oh, we're just going to take a little bit. Well, how much is a little bit, right? And they're like, oh, we're going to take a tiny speck on Mondays. Is that good? Is it not good? I honestly don't know. But there are a lot of studies that say, okay, it's beneficial in the following areas. So my new thought is, and I actually just ordered this today, was to try topical rapamycin instead of systemic rapamycin, because maybe just a little bit helping your skin versus all the other cells that you're trying to protect. And now this is just an experiment at the moment, so I'm not telling people to do this, but I think everything has a time and a place. And I'm not ready to commit to rapamycin, nor am I willing to rate it, because I think we just don't know what the detrimental effects are.
And you may end up in the same situation of like, I just don't want to have something on the list because people, the classic mentality is more, more is better, right? If a little bit is good, more is better. It may be the case that whatever, some small amount of rapamycin is good. Maybe it never gets added to your list because the potential downsides of misuse are so bad. That's it's an interesting predicament, and I think I understand. Like, just leave it off the list. Like, maybe something will change someday, but right now it's off the list.
And in a similar method, I take 10 to 12 high grade pharmaceuticals for longevity, right? But they all come with significant risk. So in no way am I ever going to rate them or put them in a book, because some idiot is going to go, aha, I can do this. And then when they get the side effects, they're going to like throw it in my face. And the answer is, I never told you to do that. Right. So I try to stick with very low risk recommendations.
That makes perfect sense. And I was looking at your system, and right. So we're going to talk about PANACEA. And in the context of your rating system, a perfect score for those, I can't remember how many are in it. Well, I can't remember how many are in it, but a perfect score would have been 105, right? If it was 3 across the board, and that gets a rating of 48 at this point, right? Am I understanding? Because I like to wrap my head around
there's no perfect score. The idea is, and sort of the way this is sort of, this started out as a plus minus column business, right? Oh, that's good for here, kind of good for there. Oh, it's really good for there, and whatever. The idea of adding them together is sort of a crazy thing, right? If you add them together over the course of a line, right, laterally, like this agent has this many points, the idea is it just reflects really how efficacious it is and how much research has been done. But that's how some people pick agents. They pick the ones with the highest scores. And you go, okay, right? But
that's a way.
It's a way, right? But the thought was, if you added them up at the bottom, right, and you had 27 points in column 1, right, and 0 in column 2, maybe your longevity protocol wasn't balanced, right? The idea here is that for most normal people without disease, because concomitant diseases will change the ratings of each column, right? If you're diabetic, obviously 7 is more serious. If you've got autoimmune diseases, 5 is worse. That being said, if you are completely normal and just getting older, you kind of want to hit the lowest hanging fruit in each of the tenets, right? Therefore, when you add the columns together, you kind of want to have an equivalent number, or at least make sure you've got some points in every category, right? There is no perfect score per se. I mean, I take 70 things a day. I have no idea how many points I have sitting in my body every day. but I know that I have every category covered.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting, and it creates a bit of a conundrum of like how to have the right rating system, because the height of the number, right? The height of the number isn't really how efficacious it is; it's what the research behind it is. That it is, in fact, well researched. That it is in some way efficacious in that tenet.
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So yeah. I love geeking out on numbers. All right, so let's jump into this panacea. What is like? Let's talk about let's go through the letters.
Okay, so the reason the panacea exists is I started this many years ago, and people would come into my office and they're like, "How come we're aging and you're not?" Right?
And you just went nanny nanny boo boo. I can't tell you.
Pretty much. Or I would start explaining this and be like, "Oh, you're nuts," and I'll be like, "Fine, I'm nuts, whatever." But then they'd creep back
Talk to me in 10 years when I look the same.
Right? Exactly, right? Their little tail between their legs and like, okay, if I could take 5 things, what would I take? It's the same. People love the number 5. If I could take 5 things. I'm like, so I sat there and I thought about it, right? So I created the panacea only because it addressed all of the issues as easily and cheaply as possible, right? And plus, if you play with the letters, it spells panacea, which is why it's named the panacea, which is moderately ironic. So the P stands for pterostyl-bene, and it can be pterostyl-bene or resveratrol because they're extremely potent sirtuin activators. Now, they do several other things, but the main reason they are listed in this is because they are sirtuin activators, and it's sirtuin 1. So that's P. A is astaxanthin because it's one of the strongest natural free radical scavengers that we have that has 0 side effects. 0. It is truly amazing. And if you want cheap astaxanthin, you just eat pink salmon because that's why it's pink. It's astaxanthin. PAN. So N is some sort of NAD precursor. And I'm not in the war of NMN versus NR versus IV versus patch versus this versus that. And everyone's arguing about loading versus basal, blah, 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 blah. That's a whole nother hour-long discussion. But having an NAD precursor by the age of 40 is obviously very important. So that's PAN. The system kind of falls apart at this point because it's 2 C's. So one is curcumin. And the reason I picked curcumin is one of the strongest anti-inflammatories that we have. The caveat being you can't have regular curcumin because the bioavailability is terrible, so it has to be one of these souped-up versions. And I'm particularly fond of metacurcumin because it's in a nanomycel, but there's a variety of different formulations. And then the last one is carnosine, which is a naturally acting dipeptide. We all have in our bodies. Men have more than women. Young people have more than old people. So by the time you become aged, it is less. And the reason I put it on the list is because it's a transglycosylating agent. So it's in the early stages of creating an AGE, it's actually able to go in and lift the glucose off and then excrete it. So it's a transglycosylating agent. So that was top 5, and that was the panacea.
Excellent. So one of my thoughts, I've heard, and I don't know how much you've dug into, like resveratrol may not have the benefits that they originally thought in humans, or that there's some struggle kind of recreating the initial results that they had in resveratrol. Have you dug into that? Are you kind of aware of that discussion?
Oh yeah, we're all aware of that, and there's yes, reputable research protocols were followed in some of the original studies. That being said. There are thousands and thousands of resveratrol studies out there, right? Just because a few labs did a few strange things and the results are like, resveratrol and pterostyl-bene as a sirtuin activator do fantastic things around the body. Is it as amazing as maybe they could have sold us a while ago? Maybe not, but it's still really rather remarkable. And in fact, I take both. I take resveratrol, I take pterostyl-bene. There are a variety of other sirtuin activators for one, but then I also take my sirtuin 3 activators. Best one, I think, is dihydroamericidin. And then hinokiol, which comes from magnolia, that's another 3. And then I activate 6 with fucodan, which comes from Japanese seaweed. So if you throw all these together, I can guarantee you that your sirtuins are about as activated as they're going to be.
Awesome. And similar kind of study with, NAD, I had one conversation that was talking about the precursors, kind of to use your factory analogy. If you just throw in more of the raw ingredients that the factory needs to produce, but the factory is not necessarily doing a great job, it doesn't necessarily produce more NAD. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think it sort of depends on the cellular model that you're looking at. I think it depends on how deficient you are. I think it depends on, I mean, there's so many variables, but I can tell you that just clinically, most people that I deal with over 40, if you stick them on some sort of NAD precursor, I usually give them a loading dose, and I don't use the IV stuff at the moment. I just do all oral. But if you give them a higher amount, it's called a loading dose, for a couple weeks, and then you bring them down to sort of a standard therapeutic dose, their energy levels skyrocket.
With no other variables, right? Just, hey, let's just do this, NR or NMN or whatever.
Yeah. So there's clinical evidence that it absolutely works. Some people love the IV bolus business. I worry that high levels may be toxic in some ways. People love to sit there and get IVs. They get like 1,000 milligrams, which I think is a little bit high, to be perfectly honest with you. The joke I always, I sort of make fun of people and go, no one has ever shown up in the emergency room dying of an NAD deficiency, right? There's no absolute reason to get an IV infusion, right? Oral supplementation is probably not unreasonable. Nasal is probably not unreasonable. The patch thing is weird because, it's temperature dependent. Most patches are. But you're absolutely NAD deficient. And so some sort of simplification is going to be useful.
That makes perfect sense. All right. So I feel like we've covered the 7 tenets. We've covered the panacea. I do have this question, and then I want to open it up to anything we may have missed. So you've got a second book out. What are kind of the major changes between the first book and the second book?
So when I started this and I wrote the first book, basically, it was an introduction of the 7 tenets and the cellular things that we knew about at that point. And there had not been a ton of longevity research. And honestly, the 15 agents that I sort of pulled out of nowhere, we didn't know that much about. So it was sort of a brand new, let's organize random stuff. By the time I got to book 2, we knew a ton more about the tenets. For example, we knew more about the sirtuins. We knew more about the mitochondrial pores. We know more about this. We know more about that. So book 2 was an attempt to sort of go into more detail of new ideas, and then introduce, I think I have 28 more agents in there, because now people are looking around the globe trying to find things that are useful. And there really are just amazing, amazing things. Like when I wrote book 1, the idea that quercetin might have an effect on senescent cells was ludicrous. But I put it in there. I said, I don't know if this is true or not, but this is the way it's looking, no guarantees. Now, by the time you get to book 2, we know that quercetin is useful. We know that dasatinib is useful. We know that fisetin is useful. We know that roxythromycin is useful. So the knowledge is just increasing very, very quickly. And the idea was to incorporate new scientific factoids with the agents that then sort of address those issues. Granted, the panacea only has 5 things in it, but I've got 50-ish, I lose track, rated. So the choices are now unbelievable. And I'm not saying take 50 things, but I'm saying you can pick and choose what is good for you and your lifestyle.
And if you're trying to address the kind of just the human nature of things, hey, let's keep it simple, stay with the panacea, at least get on the panacea. Is that kind of the thought process?
Absolutely. And anyone that comes to me fresh, I say, start that, be on it for 3 to 4 months, and then let's address other problems. And that you'd be shocked at how much better people feel with just those agents. That's
pretty phenomenal. Anything that we missed about either books, the tenets, the panacea that you want to kind of throw out there? Any more analogies? Do we have I got a fat old guy analogies, maybe like a snotty little kid allergy or something.
Oh, that's funny. Oh, I could probably pull analogies out of anywhere. It's sort of funny. So I guess the only other thing I want to sort of bring to light, and it's sort of outside of the 7 tenets, sort of, is that when you think about a longevity protocol, I think of it as a tiered pyramid, such that on the bottom are things that so it's sort of equivalent to, like, I always thought about the fifth grade lunch scheme that we all grew up with, right? Foods that you're going to eat all the time in the bottom, and then less and less and less till you get to the top, and there's always a cupcake. So there are things that you have to do every day. And people go, well, you don't talk about diet and exercise. I don't talk about it, but it's very important, right? Both resistance and endurance exercises are very important. In fact, they both activate most of the 7 tenets, which is kind of cool. Then there's all the oral stuff. That's what I do. And then, of course, there's red light, infrared light. There's peptides. There's other ways to, get to these things. I do want to address, though, that some people have luck with peptides and some people don't. And I think my theory is that if your cells are not optimized, peptides are going to be less efficacious, because peptides tell cells to do things. And if the cell isn't working, then it can't really do what it's supposed to do. So I layer them, get people on a nice protocol with all the supplements and medications. And then if we still have issues, we throw in some peptides. And then on top of that, there's all sorts of fun things to do. I'm obsessed at the moment with exosomes. So I do exosome infusions every month. I put them in my face. I put them in my body. I put them here. And they're just amazing. They're incredibly anti-inflammatory, a bunch of cytokines, growth factors. Anyway, but the point being is that this is what I talk about is a chunk of longevity, but not all of longevity. Mm-hmm. Because that's the take home.
Yeah. And the first core you would say is, exercise and probably nutrition in there together. Like you gotta be doing those. And interesting that if you're not doing those, your cells won't be optimized for your current status. And so things like peptides and you didn't say this, but maybe even exosomes wouldn't even apply to you. It's like, hey, get those taken care of first.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So I have a couple of wrap-up questions. Do you have a target age that you want to live to?
120.
120. That is a reoccurring thing. How long do you think a person who's taking the perfect protocol could live?
Probably 130.
130. And
if you think about it, this longevity business has started as we are adults, right? I am 55. So I probably blew it from the age of 35 to 40 some.
You and me both.
Yeah. Right? Maybe I shouldn't have been lying out in the sun covered in baby oil. Maybe
you too.
Maybe there were a few things that I could have done way better. Right? But the generation behind us is already eating clean. God, all the ho-hos and Twinkies I ate as a kid, because that's what your mom gave you.
So you're suggesting those are bad for us.
It's possible. It's possible. I'm not going to go out on a limb there, but literally the generation behind us, they eat better. They get this. Like my own kids are 17 and 19. They're on protocols. They know not to go out into the sun. They do their stuff incredibly well. Their lifespan is going to be unbelievable. So I would put them at 130. I'd put us at 110, 120.
And do you think, Dr. David Sinclair talks about the information theory of aging. Do you think we'll be at some point, maybe long in the future, able to pull those levers that he refers to and potentially cross that, what is it? The terminal velocity of aging?
It's possible.
Kind of interesting, huh?
It is a fantastic idea, right? And if you look at stats and you look at trajectories, you say, aha, we're going to cross it at year such and such. Will we really do that? And I don't know. If we do, it'll be 30 some years from now. It's certainly plausible, right? It's like, okay, let's go to the moon. It took them a little while to get there. We'll probably learn more about longevity than we do before we can cure cancer. How about that?
And one of the things that has come up in all these interviews that I've done is really stem cells, right? These are the repair mechanism. In fact, I had a fascinating conversation yesterday, and it talked about that the oldest lived lady, that she had one stem cell was pumping out all of her kind of immune system for, I don't know, however, first off, it's amazing that we can even determine that, but she was just down to one stem cell. When that goes away, there is nothing else. So your concern about hyperbaric chambers and the impact on stem cell, I will be asking questions after we get off. But I think that's a key piece, right? If you are damaging those small areas that can generate stem cells, that's a problem. That's I think a thing that we have to solve that I haven't heard anybody saying we've got a solution for.
No, we don't. One of the cool things you can do is you can take out your own stem cells, of course, bank them, grow them, and then give them back. And I think that's a fantastic strategy at the moment. I'm not a huge fan of going to get other people's stem cells out of the country. 90% or somewhere between 80 to 90% of the efficacy of getting other people's stem cells is the fact that they exude exosomes. So my thought is just use the exosomes. They're in this country. They're not that expensive. They're very safe, moderately legal.
Moderately not illegal.
Yes. No. They're FDA approved for topical, but we all know that maybe they, get a whiff submerged, maybe not completely topical. But they're amazingly efficacious and they're affordable. And it's amazing how much better they make you feel. I've not had the ability to measure disease progression or reversing disease progression or anything of that nature. But just in terms of a chronic user of exosomes, I just find them amazing.
And do you use them topically or are they injected? Is that the other process?
So you'll laugh. I had this big pile in front of me the other day. So I put some up my nose, trying to get it to my brain. I put some in my face. I dropped some in my eyes to improve my vision. And I put the rest in my veins so it went systemically. So I was going for the full gamut.
Can you just do it sublingual for a system or it won't cross that barrier?
I don't know.
Okay, interesting. Well, now, as with every one of these talks, I walk away with more research that I have to do. So I want to thank you for that because I actually do like that a lot. Dr. Kaufmann, how can people contact you? Wait, before you answer that, I do have one other. So what are 2 to 3 protocols, habits, mindsets? Let's call them shortcuts because everybody likes shortcuts for longevity and a long health span.
Take lots of drugs. I say that tongue in cheek, but it's funny because, oh yes, people are like, oh, I'm going to live forever. Oh, I'm going to do whatever you tell me. I'm like, well, you have to take a lot of stuff. And they're like, oh, I can't do that.
And what's option B?
No, that's exactly right. And it's funny. I'm like, well, you know what? We've done the experiment to date. We have 100% death rate.
Yep.
Everyone dies, right?
Yep.
So we've tried the natural, I'm going to take care of myself, eat well and exercise, and people are still dying, right? So
actually there are people who are not doing any of that and living longer. So like get it,
right,
some of our centenarians.
So I would argue that the first step is to accept the fact that you're going to have to do something to yourself to make all of this happen, be it orally, be it IV, be it pain and agony in a gym. You got to understand that energy is going to have to go into the system to make all of this work. So, right?
I like that. Yeah.
And if you're just cheap, diet and exercise is fantastic because not eating is pretty cheap and exercising is cheaper, right?
Yep.
And when people don't like to exercise, my advice is always park at the end of Target and just walk. It's the extra 200 yards, every few days. Take the stairs. It's not hard. Just take the stairs. So as healthy as you can possibly be is not an unreasonable place to start.
And then the other thing that's free is sleep, right? Well,
sleep is free.
It's interesting. I said in some, I can't even remember if it was I think it was on social media, a short, and I said and sleep is free for most people. And they're like, well, who's it not free for? People who really don't who have to be working. There are, people in this planet who have to be working and, getting a proper, 7.5 to 9 hours of sleep opportunity is actually not an option. It's too expensive. So I don't know why I brought that up, just to defend my position on sleep, but
sleep is actually, so here's my tidbit on sleep. Everyone always says they go to their sleep expert and they say, oh, you're watching television at night, or, oh, you're doing this and you're drinking caffeine, blah, blah, blah. So sirtuins, as I said, control all cellular homeostasis, right? This is back to Tenet 3. Sirtuins control your circadian rhythms. So if you are sirtuin deficient, you're not sleeping. So frequently when I put people on the PANACEA, now they have more energy during the day and they are actually sleeping at night. And they're like, it's a miracle. I'm like, it's not. It's
it's biology. All right, Dr. Kaufmann, how can people contact you?
So I have a website called the kaufmannprotocol.com, and there is an email address on that page, and I personally answer all emails. It takes me a while because every time I do a delightful podcast like this, I get sort of inundated. And then people get mad, like, oh, it took you more days than I thought. Well, like, I don't have an assistant. I don't have a secretary. I have no one. It is me, myself, and I personally answer all emails. So that is the way I do it. I'm also on Instagram as Kaufmann Anti-Aging. And I generally try to post either interesting tidbits or where I'm speaking, that sort of thing. I'm not a big poster because I don't have time for it, but I am on that.
Well, yeah, this is just something you do right before you go to bed, right?
Yes.
But don't do that. That's not good for sleep. What in the near future are you excited about?
Oh my gosh. There's so many things I'm excited about. So as a very specific example, a very good friend of mine, Leslie Kenny, owns Oxford Healthspan. And she is the maker of Primatine, which I think is the world's best spermidine. And I'm a huge believer in spermidine. I think it's amazing. And she called me the other day and she said, I had them make gallons of liquid spermidine. Do you want any? And I said,
not a question you
oh my gosh, yes. Right. These are dumb things we get excited about. So spermidine is amazing. It protects your DNA. It increases autophagy. It makes everything just way better for a million different reasons.
Hair growth.
And so we're always talking about, hair growth is phenomenal. Wound healing is amazing. All sorts of crazy stuff. And so we've all been taking it orally, right? And there's one company in Germany, you can get it IV, that it's ungodly expensive. So I'm about to get a shipment of liquid, pure spermidine, and I cannot wait to play with it. I'm going to inject it everywhere. It's going to be fantastic.
Up the nose.
I don't know what I'm going to drink it. I guess I'm not going to drink it. It's going to go up my nose and my face and my veins. And if I die, they'll be like, well, she died happy with spermidine.
That is pretty awesome. All right. So it's Dr. Kaufmann, and you can reach her at her website, Kaufmann Protocol. That's KAUFMANN protocol.com. And also on Instagram, it's Kaufmann Anti-Aging. And she answers her own email, so be patient. Dr. Kaufmann, thank you so much for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. Make sure to subscribe and follow. Also, make sure not to be that guy, the guy sharing this podcast with people who are not interested in living beyond the norms. If you would like to learn more about the ESS60 molecule, the molecule responsible for the single longest longevity experimental result on mammals in history, a full 90% extension of life, visit myvitalc.com. That's myvitalc as in carbon.com.